thank you to colleagues and friends. Before I introduce the panel, I got a bit emotional, but very excited during that last session, listening, hearing Callista's voice, and also hearing a lot said about him. I got quite excited seeing persons that I have not seen for a long time. I saw Ochuodho Ward, Steve Karekezi, persons that I was introduced to by CJ in the early 90s, going back to Parliament Road Arts offices. So very, very excited. Just a bit about myself. I know almost everybody in the room. I joined ACTS in 1989 as one of the first interns. In 1989, when I was a student at the University of Nairobi, and then became Callista's research assistant, one of his research assistants in 1990. And later on, 1995, I succeeded him as executive director of ACTS. And left ACTS to join NEPAD in 2002. 2009, I joined the University of Pretoria, where I am as a professor of science and innovation policy. I had 27 years or so of working very closely with Callista's. 9 years of actually mentorship under Callista. So I'm quite emotional today, and but very, very excited. Let me thank Banji for setting the stage very well. Very excellent presentation, Banji. I've known Banji, actually introduced to Banji by Callistus many years ago. When Banji concluded his excellent presentation, I went to my shelf and picked this book, which I really recommend, The Adaptive Economy, Adaptive Economy, Economic Crisis and Technological Innovation. The first 3 chapters by Callistus cover very well the issues that Banji has raised. And we'll be taking up some of these issues in the panel discussion. My job is very, very straightforward, actually very simple. I know all the panel members. I've worked with some of them for a long time. And they are going to dig deeper into the issues again that Banji has laid on the table. I'm not going to read their CVs because we'll spend the rest of our days here listening about them. But I'm going to ask each of them to spend a maximum of 15 minutes to speak to some specific issues. We'll have 1 or 2 minutes after each presentation to ask quick questions. And later on, after the 5 presentations, we'll have enough time to discuss them as a whole. The first panel member is somebody that most of us know, Professor Maureen Mackintosh at the Open University. Maureen has worked a lot on the link between industrialization and human security in Africa, focusing on manufacturing for health. A number of books, edited books, a number of policy papers. I've had the privilege to participate in some of her workshops, project meetings. And very recently, actually, very recently had the privilege of reviewing her new book proposal. So we're looking forward to reading a new book from Maureen on some of these issues that Banji has raised, manufacturing for health. So Maureen, the floor is yours, 15 minutes.
Professor Mugabe, the privilege is mine. I'm just going to try and share the screen, which I think I'm told by Agnes should work. Can people see this?
Yes, we see the screen.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. With no ado, I'll dive straight in. It's absolutely my privilege to be speaking in this extremely distinguished company. And what I want to do is talk briefly, well within my 15 minutes, about one, and taking off very much from something that the distinguished keynote speaker had to say, which was about industrial diversification. And in particular, to look at the scope for the productivity of the health sector as a generator of both industrialization and stronger health security. And I want to make the point when I'm starting that this isn't, Professor Mugabe was very kind, but this is not my work. This is absolutely the work of a network of people with whom I've been working very closely for maybe 15 years, predominantly African scholars, but also Indian and Brazilian. And I'm going to acknowledge throughout the importance of their work. This is not my work. I think what I want to start by saying, I'm just trying to make sure I can see the full screen. Yeah, now I'm there. This is a topic, industrialization for health, which there is decades of work on in African, Asian, and Latin American countries. As well as elsewhere, but particularly, it's a recognition of the importance of local manufacturing of medicines, of supplies for healthcare, which goes right back to independence and before. In Kenya, in the academic literature alone, you can trace this argument back into the 1980s with work by Professor Germano-Mwabu. In many countries, for example, post-independence, countries in Africa built up pharmaceutical production to support publicly led expansion of primary care. Examples there are Tanzania, Ghana, Zimbabwe, but there are many others. In the 1950s and 1960s, India, pharmaceutical policies were built up to create industrial inputs for publicly led healthcare. Professor Banji referred to that. And in Brazil, the health industrial complex policies, which have a very long history, have been built around the development of the single healthcare system, the SUS. These are very old established arguments, and they're constantly rediscovered, as we have done in the last few years in the network of research that led to the book called Making Medicines in Africa, which in Kenya was led by ACTS. What's been interesting is that over many years, there's been substantial opposition to this argument, to the importance of, if you like, what I'm going to call the industrialization through the health industries in Africa. And in particular, in recent years, what I'll call the global health establishment, though it's a little bit unfair, has really been resisting these views somewhat. But that resistance has absolutely been shattered by COVID-19 in the last 2 years. As local experts predicted, including my colleague Jeffrey Banda, African countries were immediately during the COVID-19 crisis at the back of the queue for supplies, for medicines, and for vaccines. What we saw was a global supply chain collapse, which landed on African countries extremely severely. And that was the result of existing high import dependence, relatively low tech and limited local manufacturing capabilities, and low purchasing power on international markets. And what that story has done is it's demonstrated the critical nature of local manufacturing for tackling medical emergencies and for generating health security. In the process of that, as has been mentioned, there's been enormous amounts of innovation. And that's especially been true where manufacturing is stronger, for example, in Kenya and in South Africa, where we've seen sanitizer in Kenya developed using local ethanol, adaptation of delivery systems for medication, local swabs and testing kits, engineering innovation right across the continent. And in a recent webinar, there's a reference at the end to this, it's online. This is an African manufacturer commenting, saying really some of those innovations were by people who weren't given the opportunity to innovate in a pro-COVID world. So where we are now is that African governments, among many others, are very much more focused on strengthening local health security. How to make it happen in practice through local industrialization is the issue facing many, many policymakers and industrialists. Effectively, even before the pandemic, in the last few years, really, before the COVID-19 hit, many African governments had included pharmaceuticals and other medical supplies, but particularly medicines, in revived industrialization policies. It's true in many EAC countries. There was an enormous amount of African Union support for that before COVID-19. This is another quote from an African manufacturer who was also associated with the webinar I've just mentioned. That was in late 2020. He said, look, for decades, this is a summary, but using his words, for decades, African healthcare had been neglected. And he said, when top government officials fell ill, they could hop on a plane. When COVID-19 hit, they were no longer able to do that, with often tragic consequences. This, what he called a national disgrace, has created a new realization of the need to invest in local health systems, including supply chains. This is a major realization. It's a major industrialization opportunity. The health sector is very large, and there are large export opportunities. An African academic in the same webinar commenting on this, I think this was my colleague Julius Mugwagwa, said that the pandemic has been a wake-up call on this topic. The issue confronting everybody is how to stay awake, how to actually implement it. So the situation is that the importance of these issues was already understood. The issue is how to make change happen. And what I want to do very briefly in rather more than just about 10 minutes is to look at 5 examples of the kinds of innovation that this work over many years now has thrown up as important in trying to build on health industrial synergies for industrialization and health security, and to use the insights that Professor Ouma had in terms of what it takes to overcome resistance to innovation from his book, Innovation and Its Enemies, which came out just about at the same time as the Making Medicines in Africa Network book. I won't read those through, I'm just going to do them and to remark that this comes from work by largely African colleagues involved in a current project, which is on industrial health linkages to improve cancer care, and from a lot of earlier work. The first point I want to make is the importance of agency. And this again is the first quote from Professor Ouma. He says the design of new technologies needs to include the potential beneficiaries. When we interviewed them, my Tanzanian colleagues interviewed large numbers of cancer patients in Tanzania. One of the things they expressed was the need much better to address severe pain in cancer. It's an example of involving the beneficiaries. Since then, there's been a really productive, extraordinary discussion in Tanzania on what it takes from a whole range of stakeholders of high level and patient stakeholders. And 2 things emerge. One is the importance of a new mindset. One of the questioners in the chat mentioned this, importance of new mindsets, in particular, taking response to pain much more seriously, involving patients in defining need. And once you involve patients in defining need, you have to rethink procurement, which is some work, picks up on some work that I've done with colleagues at KEMRI as well as in Tanzania. It means revising procurement policies, building on patients' need, moving away from building on repeat orders to looking for affordable scope to meet need better. And in terms of pain management, government interventions, including better training, clinical training, changed government support for licensing and managing of as controlled substance morphine, moving through clinical officer and nursing prescribing. This is the Ugandan experience, very successful, and better support for palliative care. In other words, it involves a range of aspects of innovation, of which agency involving the beneficiaries, as Professor Ouma pointed out, is the start. What it also involves, I think that example illustrates, is if you're going to unlock industrial health synergies for health security, is you have to break out of existing habits and routines, which Professor Ouma notes in his book people can be understandably reluctant to do. What the pandemic crisis has done is it's seen normally cautious governmental and private sector firms take some new risks, or they're real organizational and cultural change. The question is, can it be built on? One possible example is the issue of oncology drugs. At the moment, most oncology drugs, I think no oncology drugs are produced at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa. I know of none. However, they are mainly off patent. This is not a disruptive technology. These are chemical drugs, and manufacturing, though relatively complex, it's incremental technological change. There are enormous challenges. They include toxicity, severe waste management problems, the need to protect staff from cytotoxic drugs. Hospitals using the drugs face the same challenges: toxicities, waste management. There's a current argument around, often from global health experts, that the drugs need to be better used before we think about local production within the African subcontinent. But that's not necessarily the case. If you try and think about a shift, then it's possible, this is thinking innovatively, that local production of, say, a dozen key essential oncology drugs in the subcontinent could reduce prices. We know there are price cartels keeping these prices up, including in Indian research shows. It would reduce stockouts. It could allow and incentivize shared learning. In effect, what you would need would be oncologists, nurses, and patients working with manufacturers and machine operators to get it right. It might be extremely productive, and it would involve big shifts in changing habits and routines. That's incremental technology. Another interest of Professor Ouma was disruptive technologies. And this is a quote which I think is extremely timely from his book. The underlying technologies, he said, this is about disruptive technology, are viewed by large corporations as products to be sold in globally competitive markets. Emerging nations, on the other hand, he said, may view them as generic technologies that provide new platforms for local innovation. In other words, using them as platform technologies to do somewhat differently. mRNA vaccines probably fall right into that discussion. I owe to Jeffrey Banda, who's working on the topic at the moment, and I think is online, the argument that vaccine production capability, he said, I can quote him, potentially forms part of a broader development of industrial competencies in biotech. So the push to bring vaccine production to Africa is actually a major opportunity. It's potentially a platform on which African firms, supported by governments, working with a recognition of health needs, can build broader technological capabilities, including monoclonal antibodies for a range of diseases, including cancer. So developing capabilities in this new and challenging platform technologies needs medium-term planning, it needs patient capital, it needs subsidy initially, and it needs consistent support for scientific work in the African subcontinent over time. In other words, it means shifting away from current conventional wisdom in ways which Professor Ouma was really very sharp in terms of identifying the challenge. The fourth example, I only have 5, is something that's called industrial deepening. It really builds again on this issue of how to incentivize change. And this element of work I owe to Professor Samuel Wangwe in Tanzania, who's, as you all know, is a well-known industrial economist. Professor Ouma argued that institutions are crucial in managing change, providing information, reducing uncertainty, providing incentives, channeling resources, and managing continuity, which brings some contradictions. Innovative industrial policy, which is what we're talking about here, is key. It's the institutional key, as our keynote speaker has really already said, to unlocking, in the case of this talk, health industrial synergies. It means moving away from reactive and level playing field approaches to industrial policy, building sectoral policies instead to promote continuous improvement in the health industries, medicines, medical supplies. And in particular, this has been Professor Wangwe's point over quite a long period, it involves means involving health system stakeholders in industrial policy in identifying upstream improvements. For example, opportunities to produce active pharmaceutical ingredients, locally produced excipients, better packaging, things that really unlock the capability of the health industries, and many of which were blocked by the COVID-19 crisis. And this means, again, active government roles in industrial policy, solving investors' problems, breaking deadlocks between suppliers and customers, bridging gaps. And finally, last example, it involves, I think, local thinking on feasible and sustainable business models, of which I think there are lots of opportunities for more work. Professor Ouma again pointed out that what you're doing with innovation is tackling a conflict between innovation and incumbency. And family business networks and conglomerates that dominate much of the East African private sector are examples of this. These business models, we know, have huge strengths. They're business survivors long-term, where infrastructure is poor, investment and working capital is expensive, upstream suppliers are weak, regulatory frameworks struggle. There's a current critique, which Professor Wangwe and others have argued is correct, that the business models also have limits, and their particular limit is when technology transfer is needed. Responses recently have included joint ventures with high-income countries and partial or whole buyouts by Indian and South African-based multinationals in pharmaceuticals. But you could do more. There could be much more active local policy thinking, I suggest, to actively shape ways in which joint ventures, PPPs, private equity models could sustain some of the family business strengths while supporting active tech transfer and upgrading. Maybe much more support for developing an African Mittelstand in the German sense of highly productive and family firms. So we're arguing, it's a network piece of work, this is my conclusion, for fostering innovation for inclusion. Professor Ouma argued that innovation fosters inclusion when it addresses unmet needs, and we've given examples of that, and that implies tackling incumbency when incumbency represents power plus exclusion. We've argued that effective implementation of this injunction requires framing the policy space and objectives to focus on what we've called local health security. I owe this to Julius Magwagwa and Jeffrey Banda in particular. And the notion of local health security builds on the recognized benefits of proximity, shorter supply chains, inclusive geographical distribution patterns, and recognizes the importance of positionality. That is the crucial importance of building up local African agency within global health and the global economy. Professor Ouma argued, this is my final slide, that in an increasingly complex and uncertain world, the risks of doing nothing may outweigh the risks of innovating, and COVID-19 has been the perfect example. So how to stay awake? It involves perhaps locally institutional representation, the establishment of institutional representation of this search for synergy. The innovation, in other words, needs in some sense institutional feet. It needs to be someone's job, responsibility, accountability to build the sectoral innovation and production systems needed for better health, to find ways to identify and share mutual benefits in health and industry through mutual learning, and that's hard still, to represent health need and health security requirements to industry and to generate patient capital to make it happen. And as a final remark from Indian colleagues, Indian experience shows how it can go wrong, how industrial and health policy can move way apart over time without effective following of this role. Thank you very much for listening. That's the end.
Thank you, Maureen. Excellent. Thank you very much. We have 1 minute for Maureen, if you have any questions. Any quick questions? And are there any questions? I don't see any hands. Tom, do you have it?
We don't see any questions to Maureen. Maybe we can request people they can keep until the discussion.
It's fine. Much better to keep going.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. Professor Erika Mbula, if she is around. Erika is around, yes. to make the presentation. And most of us know Erika, and some of us work with Professor Kraemer-Mbula. She is a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg here in South Africa. Erika has worked a lot on innovation policy for development, inclusive innovation for development in Africa. And she is going to talk about industrialization through innovation. Erika is a member of a special working group here in South Africa on this particular topic. Erika, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Professor Mugabe, and good day, everyone. I hope you can see my slides. Would you please confirm that you can see them?
Yes, we can see your slides.
We can see.
Excellent. So yes, good day, everyone, and it is really a privilege to be part of this event. Very briefly, I was fortunate to meet Professor Juma many years ago as a young scholar, and on several occasions, and in every interaction that I had with him, he was extremely generous and inspiring, and always left me pondering about something new that somehow later would become a new area of research for me. He was a mentor and inspiration to many, and I remember very clearly a small workshop that he organized in Paris while he was busy with I think it was his book, The New Harvest, and he insisted each time that the youngest scholars, particularly the female scholars in the workshop, spoke first. It was those gestures that really spoke to his awareness and commitment to building the capacity of younger scholars and to empowerment. So I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion today, and thanks for the organizers for putting this together. My name, as I was introduced, is Erika Kraemer-Mbula, and I'm at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, where I am part of this trilateral chair in transformative innovation, the fourth industrial revolution and sustainable development, which is a partnership between the University of Johannesburg, ACTS, and the University of Sussex in the UK. And our main preoccupation is to explore the ways in which innovation can be a driver of inclusion and sustainability. We acknowledge that innovation is not always good for everyone, and if we don't pay careful attention to the distributional effects of innovation, we can very easily overlook important actors that are contributing to valuable innovative solutions in society. And we argue that this is the case of the informal economy, and this is what I will be discussing today. So in my presentation, I will briefly touch on 3 points. First, I will provide an overview of the informal economy, especially highlighting its role in industrialization. Then I will mention some of the challenges that some of the informal actors have experienced in the light of the pandemic that we are undergoing, as well as the broader context of digitalization or the fourth industrial revolution. And I will conclude with some reflections. There are various agendas guiding Africa's aspirations to develop and to advance, and this slide features some of those, such as the High Five African Development Bank agenda, the Agenda 2063, and the broader sort of 2030 agenda with the SDGs. They are interrelated, and they share a desire for the continent to modernize, and through science, technology, and innovation as a driver of inclusive and sustainable industrialization, that in a way that generates jobs and improves the quality of life for African people. So again, a people-centered approach is very much at the center of Africa's agendas for transformation, and it very much aligns with the Professor Juma's vision, as the initial remarks have reminded us. Professor Banji Yinka has also reminded us of the importance that industrialization takes in this sort of African aspiration for development. So the case for industrialization rests on the idea that successful structural transformation will give rise to increased productivity and higher incomes and these positive linkages between different productive sectors. So, this process of structural change is seen as a shift to a progressive shift to higher value-added goods and services, which requires investment and the accumulation of capabilities and infrastructure. And industrialization in Africa has several challenges, and our keynote has talked about industrialization dynamics in the continent and several of the challenges related to it. But just to mention a few, is being driven by global imperatives, which has led to an increased concentration of industrial activity and widened in a way the disparity between these sort of industrialized core, specialized in high value-added activities and serving international markets, and this low-income, technological, weaker segment of producers. So in other words, has increased the inequalities between those sophisticated producers and those less sophisticated. African countries have experienced insufficient industrial growth and some even premature deindustrialization, and the linkages between manufacturing and services, particularly this large base of low-skilled services, remain very weak. Also, another aspect to highlight that, and this is where I want to focus my comments, is that the majority of micro and small enterprises are operating informally, and to a large extent, they are disconnected from these sort of high-value manufacturing activities that tend to be the focus of attention when we talk about industrialization. And this is precisely the argument that I want to put forward, that expanding and strengthening innovation and technological capabilities in informal enterprises can be a route for bottom-up industrialization. Why care about the informal economy? It affects all countries, but is highly context specific in the way it manifests in different geographical spaces. But some of the features of informality is that it's diverse, even though often we refer to it as a homogeneous set of activities. It comprises multiple activities related to manufacturing services, construction, waste collection, and so on. I'll not go into the definitional issues, but they are largely demand-driven, and they satisfy a demand for low-cost goods coming often from low-income consumers. And they generally are very much in tune with the local dynamics. It doesn't mean they're not affected by global dynamics. Imports of cheap products from other developing regions do affect opportunities by informal actors, but the way in which they operate is very much sort of local. So it's safe to say that informal is normal in the African context, and it comprises about 3/4 of non-agricultural employment, contributes over 1/3 of the continent's GDP. This is pre-pandemic. Probably these figures are higher now. It generates a huge percentage of new jobs in various countries. The majority of micro enterprises are informal, and we see a growing presence of informal settlements and mega slums, for instance, in many African urban spaces. And this is visible. You can look at the figures, but you can also look around you the moment you step out into any city or street or in rural area in any African country. So it's really something that is not something that happens in the margins, but one can argue it's really what people do. This is the reality of the majority of Africans in the way in which they make a living. And even though I started saying that it affects all regions, it is particularly predominant in the context of Africa. And you can see by this graph that in some African regions it can reach over 80% of non-agricultural employment. There are two sides to informality, and often we tend to see it in the light of one or the other. So there's generally a skewed perception or on either highlighting the negatives, the connection with poverty and low productivity, precariousness of work and lack of social protection, or we see an emphasis on the positives, on the opportunities that it brings to employment and entrepreneurship, collaboration, skills development, and creativity, and so on. Also, there is literature highlighting the connection between informality and resilience, which in the light of COVID-19, I think, and the external shocks that we are likely to experience more in the future, is quite an important dimension of informality. For instance, in the city where I live, thousands of informal waste pickers make a living from recycling, and the value that they save in terms of landfill space amounts to almost 1 billion rand per annum. The activities are tightly connected to a chain of formal activities related to recycling, but also other manufacturing activities. So informal actors don't operate by themselves. They are part of a system. They are involving not only informal actors, but also actors actually of different degrees of formality and informality, which exchange goods and services, knowledge and ideas. And that's why it's so important to take up this systemic view of informality rather than something that happens in the margins. Very quickly, the pandemic had a very severe impact on the informal economy. Most countries went into a lockdown, and that involved sort of closing down the spaces where most informal actors operate. And many of them had responded with different coping strategies, borrowing money, utilizing their savings and seeking financial help, and so on. But it also tells us the story about resilience and how quickly many of them managed to get back to work. And this is relying on a survey that was conducted in South Africa, in a particular region in South Africa. The other side of the story is the innovation that was displayed by informal actors, which is testament to this resilience and ability to respond to new realities. Many of the track and trace services in informal settlements were organized locally and informally. The informal sector responded very quickly to the production of face masks, which are compulsory, for instance, in South Africa. We've seen the development and installation of hand washing stations relying on limited technology and often mobile. So there's a lot of innovation that has emerged informally that is hardly captured. Actually, and one of the strengths of the informal economies is connection to the social networks. It will be important to draw on these advantages to ensure that the informal economy becomes an asset for this larger process of structural transformation. And I want to, in a minute or so, mention the broader dynamics of digitalization and if you want to use the terminology of fourth industrial revolution. So for the past 15 years or so, we've seen African economies being largely transformed by ICTs, and some scholars have referred to it as the possibility for leapfrogging. In an article that I'm busy working with Professor Kaplinsky, who will speak after me, we highlight some of the dynamics affecting the informal economy when it comes to digitalization and the adoption and opportunities that have emerged through the use and entrepreneurship that has emerged through digital technologies. But we've seen a very rapid adoption of mobile phones. The internet capacity is exploded in the continent, although we see that that broadband connectivity is still low. It's only 1/3 of the population that has access to the internet. But digital technologies have been really a source of dynamism and innovation and entrepreneurship. And we see many of the solutions that have emerged through the pandemic have had to do with the use and adoption of digital technologies. Nevertheless, it's not all positive, and one has to be very careful with the implications that the adoption of these new business models based on digital platforms, for instance, the new apps and the transport services that have emerged, for instance, through the use of applications, have raised concerns related to the precariousness of work, for instance, which requires very strong local regulations to mitigate the negative impacts of that. We've seen the emergence of online platforms allowing entrepreneurs to now buy and sell services during the crisis, and it's something that we need to try and think of upscaling and enhancing the benefits of that. So in the last few seconds, I want to highlight a few points of what can policymakers do. On the one hand, I think it's very important to address those negatives, right, that we were talking about at the beginning, addressing the basic needs of informal actors, ensure that there's relief benefits, that there's childcare facilities, that there's social protection offered to informal actors operating in urban areas. On the other side, try and enhance the positive contributions of the informal economy, ensuring that innovations emerging from the informal sector are recognized and captured. In other words, improving measurements, making sure that one focuses on enhancing and creating local innovation systems. So not being afraid of building non-traditional partnerships involving informal actors and informal sector associations, for instance, with other formal actors in the national innovation system. And finally, speaking to this dimension of the digital technologies, ensuring that the new technologies are adopted by and accessible by informal entrepreneurs and micro enterprises, particularly digital technologies in disadvantaged areas, and actually ensuring that digital skills are sort of taken up and widespread in disadvantaged communities to ensure that the benefits of digitalization reach the most disadvantaged communities. Let me stop there. I hope I haven't taken too much time.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you, and spot on, excellent. I'm sure we have one or two questions for Erika. And quick questions, comments. Erika's presentation takes us back to, again, this book, The Adaptive Economy, chapter 4, where CJ and others attacked in the early 90s addressed these issues around innovation in the informal sector. So topical issues in the early 90s, still topical issues today during a health crisis. Thank you, Erika. Is Dr. Ochuodho back?
Yes, Prof. I'm extremely sorry about that.
Are you ready? I was actually, I was wondering what was happening with your computer, because I recall you and CJ were the first Kenyans to own computers. I recall in the early 90s.
I hope it.
So let's
So, Professor John, we do have a question. One question as we wait for a question for Erika. It's there on the chat.
What's the question?
The question is about, do you see the informal link as an enabler of upgrading innovation in informal enterprises?
Yes, Erika,
Catherine Kireru.
May I answer?
Yes, please.
Good. So yes, thank you for this question, and I think this is precisely the idea of looking at informality within as a system, rather than seeing it as an isolated segment of entrepreneurs that are somehow disconnected and have particular needs separate from other formal activities. And when you look at it as a system, you start realizing that those informal actors, and in our research we found that those informal actors that do find these connections and they do find ways of interacting with particularly education and training organizations or different types of technology suppliers, they are able to the outcomes and the benefits of innovation become much larger than with those that do not. So when we start sort of working on the system, on the health of the local innovation system, where we involve actors of different degrees and levels of formality and informality, we start seeing more opportunities to create these bridges and linkages. So yes, definitely the short answer is yes, definitely I see the informal formal as an enabler for upgrading innovation.
Thank you, Erika. Dr. Ochuodho, are you ready?
Yes, I hope the screen can be seen.
We can see it. You have,
Thank you very much.
Give you not more than 10 minutes now. Sorry.
Yeah, just to share that I'm doing this partly on behalf of the Africa Diaspora Alliance. And also earlier on, you talking, I think a speaker was talking about reluctance, hesitation to adopt to innovation. As you well know, we've been through a bit of that. I'm remembering the late 80s, early 90s, trying to introduce computers in Kenya. No less than head of state speaking at a public rally and saying we don't need computers because they'll take away jobs. And part of our work was to convince the officialdom as well as private sector that didn't need to be the case. I'll try in the 10 minutes to try to address the issue of diaspora intellectual and financial capital, and particularly also what roles they can play and already playing in promoting micro and mini industries, particularly in East Africa. Thanks, Professor Erika, for stepping in. In terms of the SDGs, the goal number 9, industry, innovation, infrastructure, is the bit that we are tackling. And for my part in particular, sustainable industrialization, leveraging technology. Fortunately, the SDGs are very much in line also with the Africa Union's Agenda 2063, and in particular, in particular, the aspiration number 1 that addresses the issue of inclusive growth. Goal number 2 in particular is of interest, well-educated citizens that have a revolution underpinned by STI. In that regard, of course, education and STI skill is the priority area. Equally, goal number 4, transformed economies, and in particular, STI-driven manufacturing, industrialization, and value addition. I cannot forget to mention the year 2021, the UN having declared it the year of creative and cultural industries. Africa has got pretty strong culture, but the issue of knowledge management, because we also addressing in my sharing the aspect of the knowledge part. So the creative industries, and I may mention that sometime last year I was privileged to participate just before COVID hit hard. Former President Obasanjo convened an African intellectual fiesta, which came up with 6 areas that were considered to be high job propensity areas. And the creative industries was one of them. So I'm glad we're talking about the issue of the knowledge economy. In that regard, allow me also to recall in the year 2019, September, first Pan-African Knowledge Management Conference took place at UN offices in Nairobi. and major outcomes came about. Of course, the area of creative arts and culture, heritage still stick out important, but how do we even monetize them? There was a declaration signed by the knowledge partnership partners that were present from different parts of the globe, as well as different parts of Africa. Having talked about that, the diaspora as a major cog on the wheel that brings significant amount. We can see from the year around 2006, this is for ECOWAS, the diaspora remittances surpassed official development assistance, and it's continued to grow. So it's something in terms of new money, new finance that we need to look into. Maybe if I pause there and just say that from the Kenyan experience, and I guess this is true of most African countries, rather than waiting to rely on government, perhaps if we had bankable propositions, the diaspora can believe in, it's one avenue that we can utilize to realize industrialization. In the case of the Kenyan diaspora, we have a broad definition of diaspora in the case of Kenya Diaspora Alliance, but allow me to bypass that. They're either people who do businesses outside the country or own businesses out of the country. But I should also add that they also come in different shades. For the Kenyan case, there are about 4 million diasporas outside the country and remitting into the country about $3 billion. Last year, 3.3 billion. Contrary to predictions, it went high, up by 15%. It was thought it would come down because of COVID. And I should say that it's now surpassing the top 3 agricultural exports of Kenya put together. To analyze diaspora, I normally use this framework, diaspora being at the middle, but of course, both the host and source country and governments are important, as well as the corporate world. We work very closely with the financial sector in Kenya, the telcos, the fintechs, real estate companies, insurances, and so on and so forth. All of them have a major role to play in terms of, we believe in what we call the 4 Ps, public, private, people's partnerships. Now, in terms of the remittances, again, I've already indicated that for Africa, it's about 80 billion, and that's roughly the distribution of how the funding comes in. But in particular, this new potential, how do we tap into the African Caribbeans? By the way, the Africa Diaspora Alliance is incorporated both in North Carolina, as well as yesterday was incorporated in Kingston, Jamaica as well. So the Caribbeans, and one of the areas that's concerned is, why do people from West Africa, for example, or Africa travel to Europe or to North America to go to the Caribbeans, while 5-hour flights, direct flights, are possible between West Africa and the Caribbeans? So that's an area that currently we gathered from a senior federal Nigerian government official. I think test flights, trial flights are taking place, and we need to encourage business and trade and information exchange between the African diasporas and the home country. I'll bypass the Kenyan part in the interest of time, but I may just mention that a major assembly we have every year, annual Diaspora Homecoming Convention, hundreds of people who get back home, normally in December. And we have the second Africa Diaspora Summit coming up in Nigeria, June next year. We're expecting a senior government official to participate. That's why we've moved from previously it was symposium, but this time it's going to be summit in collaboration with NIDCOM. That's the Nigeria Diaspora Commission. So it's one avenue that we utilize to bring together the diasporas. In terms of outreach, because how do we access the diasporas? Of course, technology now allows that to happen. I'm quickly going through some of these motions, and we keep monitoring. And we do know the kind of constituency we are able to reach. One of the latest webinars we've had, we reached 1.6 million in 50 different countries. In an earlier webinar, we're able to reach 600,000 in 127 countries. So that's the coverage. Most of these are Kenyan diasporas, but with the Africa Diaspora Alliance and other partners, meaning basically Africans, wherever in the world they are, we can have access to them. So of course, that's a footprint basically in every part of the globe. In terms of innovation in the health sector, traditional foods and medicines are a major area of concern. The Diaspora COVID Task Force, without fear of any contradiction, has come up with what I believe currently is the world's best remedy for COVID. Within 48 hours, people positive turn negative. More than 5,000 have turned negative. I don't want to belabor too much on it because it's from 7 natural plants. It's also completely risk-free. That's work of the diasporas. Please, let's pay attention more to some of these remedies, and particularly the natural, or what some people call African remedies. In terms of technology and innovation, of course, Kenya's prowess in mobile apps, blockchain, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, machine language, robotics, again, there is no time to elaborate. These are areas Africa needs to pay attention to. Allow me, moderator, to pinpoint particularly national resource management. There's a lot of wealth under our knees, oil, gold, minerals, and all that. I think it's only Malawi or Zambia I saw come up with a national resource management plan. Automation of that information through geographical information systems or spatial data interfaces is a major area Africa needs to pay attention to. Of course, other areas like biotechnology, one of the major projects coming out of Kenyans in Boston, the university project, where 500 acres of land in one of the rural areas of Kenya have been slated to create, targeted to create 100,000 jobs, and also to produce a biotechnology vaccine, again, developed by African diasporas, in this particular case, based out of Boston. But I should also add, some may not be aware, Africa's first 2 smartphones, Silk, was released 3 years ago in Kenya by diaspora returnees from the US, but also in Rwanda, Mara phones, producing mobile phones. Until Africa has sovereignty of technology end to end, it's very difficult to talk of independence. So yes, political independence, but economic and technological independence, even much more important. Maybe finally, I wanted just to say, what are our asks? Our asks are, can we work together? How do we bridge the gap? Currently, 60% of Africa doesn't have broadband connectivity. How do we work together? And in this regard, I should say, African Internet Pioneers Consortium are keen to work with other partners to realize, maybe in the next 10 years, to reduce that gap by a significant number. Otherwise, thanks so much for your time, and sorry once again, Prof, for the earlier hiccup.
Thank you, Shem. Thank you. I'm sure we'll have questions on this presentation. Any quick ones? Any quick questions before we move to?
No, not yet. Not yet. Now we can continue, but they are coming up after the speakers.
Okay. Yes. Again, I'd commend that you go to the New Harvest. There is a section there on. Kalestas had some ideas on leveraging Africa's diasporas. The book is freely available. And, very interesting ideas related to what we've heard from Shem a short while ago. Let's move to the next panel speaker, Professor Raphael Kaplinsky, who is an honorary professor at SPRU, Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex, an old friend of ACTS, an old friend of Kalestas. Did some work together. And some of us got to know Raphael through Kalestas. Karibu. Raphael, you are muted. We can't hear you.
You are muted.
I said, Asante sana Bwana Mkubwa. It's a great privilege to be with you. I met Paul Streeton for the first time in the early 1990s. He's a great guru in development economics. And I believe that Calestis might have been at the same meeting. It was on appropriate technology. I said to Streeton, I was very pleased to meet someone. I'd heard about him for many years. And he said to me, he had a minimum and maximum objective at every meeting. The minimum was to re-meet some old friends, and there are old friends in this group that I'm speaking to now. He said the maximum objective is to make some new friends, and I've been able to make new friends through this presentation this afternoon. And he said, if I learn anything in addition, that's just a bonus. So I have learned a bit, and I will try and include it in my presentation, but let me move forward. I knew Calestis most clearly during the 1970s and the 1980s. In the 1970s, I worked in Kenya with him. I'd just done a report on transfer pricing in the pineapple industry. Del Monte had moved its operations from Indonesia to Kenya. They'd expanded for 13 years. They hadn't paid 1 cent of profit. When we unpicked that story, it turns out that Del Monte was selling the pineapples to Germany, well, delivering the pineapples to Germany, but selling it to Del Monte in Panama at a loss. And Del Monte in Panama was selling it to Del Monte in Germany at a loss. There were no profits either in Kenya or in Germany. And of course, there were a lot of profits in Panama, which was a tax deal. I told Calestis about this. He asked to see the report, and he achieved in one weekend what I was totally unable to achieve with all my time at the Kenyan Central Bank. There was a 2-page spread in the Sunday Nation about Del Monte and what had happened. Within 3 months, Del Monte declared their first profit ever, saying they'd been working for 13 years and they'd eventually managed to turn these operations into profit. So well done, Calestis, and an example of his energy, enthusiasm, and initiative. I also learned a great deal from Calestis on indigenous technical knowledge. I had done some work on traditional breakfast cereals versus Western breakfast cereals, showing how the nutrient cost of Western breakfast cereals were far higher than traditional cereals. And Calestis then unfolded to me his experience in Western Kenya with his mother, harvesting more than 30 types of vegetative matter, which were not in any food textbooks, but helped her to feed the family in a healthy way. And from that, Calestis helped me to understand the enormous power of the enormous body of informal technological capabilities. And aside from the friendship that I've had with Calestis, enjoying his wonderful sense of humor and twinkling eyes, I also learned a great deal from him. Now, I've been asked to speak to the Del Monte related part of what I'm talking about, although I think there are lots of interesting points to be made about appropriate technology and indigenous technological change. The central point I will talk to is in my book, I don't know whether you can see it, which has just come out, which is that the global economy is now at a historical turning point. We're at a structural break. And if we understand this, and that means going back in history, and I'll talk about that briefly, unless we understand the systemic nature of that structural break, it will be like moving the chairs in the Titanic. We will move in incremental ways and hope to achieve incremental gains. But as you'll see later on, when I map out some of the aggregates, incremental change is no longer an adequate response to the crisis facing the global economy, and to Africa as well. So to get that story of the systemic picture, we have to go back to the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1970s. I'm going to build on work here of Chris Freeman and Carlotta Perez, both at Sussex, whom Calestis studied with. And their view is that since the Industrial Revolution, we've had 5 major epochs, well, 4.5, we're in the midst of the 5th one, early parts of the 5th one, where the world has been transformed in substantial ways. Each one has been driven by a technology which has pervasive applications across the economic system, that offers major reductions in cost and product improvements, that is in unlimited supply and has descending cost. So the first, and each of these waves, the technology both improves productivity, Adam Smith, the division of labor, but it also enables producers to reach larger markets. And Adam Smith said, the larger the market, the greater the capacity for the division of labor and productivity growth. The first of these waves was water power and canals in the 18th century. Then the next century, the first part, steam technology and railways, in both cases enabling producers to reach wider markets. Then the second half of the 19th century, heavy engineering, telegraphs and shipping, the communications infrastructure, which enabled national producers to meet global consumers. And the fourth one, which dominated the 20th century, was mass production, beginning with Henry Ford's Model T in 1908, spurred on by the Second World War, the militarization of Germany in the 1930s and in the UK, and then by the welfare state after the Second World War. That period after the Second World War, we call it the Golden Age, saw a rate of economic growth which was historically unprecedented and was not confined just to the high-income countries. It was a period of miraculous widespread growth. But towards the mid-1970s, mass production ran out of steam. And two important developments, which I want to talk about now, which have implications for the policy agenda in the future. The first is that the plutocracy, the rich, grabbed the reins of power in the late 1970s and early 1980s, beginning with Margaret Thatcher, then with Ronald Reagan, and took over the means of affecting people's attitudes. It became social media in later years, but it was much deeper than that and was very purposive. And they pushed through an agenda of a neoliberal agenda of autarky. And what that agenda did was to promote the growth of a short-term financial sector which inhibited the capacity of producers to engage in long-term investments and in long-term innovation. So the first thing about the collapse of the Golden Age was the rise of neoliberalism, autarky, and their capacity to shape the political agenda. The second one is as productivity growth fell during the 1970s, the rate of profit began to decline. How did the big corporations react to that? They reacted by deep globalization. They took advantage of cheap labor in developing countries, and I've documented in the book that led to a revival of profit, but at the same time leading to a revival of profit. Of course, it decimated the manufacturing sectors in the rich countries and led to this overwhelming and substantially impressive growth of export-led industrialization in China, particularly. So just briefly, the outcome for the rich countries of the atrophy of mass production culminated in the Great Recession of 2008, which was as great as the Great Depression in 1929. It culminated in massive inequality and growing absolute poverty in the rich countries. It led to growing precarity, the lack of certainty of life and jobs in the rich countries, with massive degrees of informalization associated with 0 hours contracts, great degree of exclusion, and of course the COVID pandemic in recent years has exacerbated all these problems. But the critical thing is we must not seek to explain the economic crisis which is in front of us in terms of a COVID-induced crisis or COVID-caused crisis. The COVID pandemic merely accentuated underlying fissures in the system. Now, what that has done, it's led to 3 crises of unsustainability in the rich countries. The crisis of economic sustainability I've spoken about, the linked crisis of political unsustainability, the growth of populism, the age of rage, which is a good way of describing the decay of life, and the erosion of liberal democracy. And I want to give great importance to this, an unfolding economic crisis. Now, the point of the Freeman and Paris approach, this historical approach, is that the economic, the socio-political, and the environment are all interlinked. Economic decay gives you political decay. Political decay feeds back into economic decay. Economic, the nature of the mass production paradigm gives you an environmental crisis. The environmental crisis feeds back into the unsustainability of economic growth, into international migration, and that fuels again the rise of populist politics. So we're at this period when mass production is basically atrophied. We have a great crisis we're experiencing and which is going to unfold in the future. And the question is, what of the future? And here we are lucky, and the previous speaker and Erika both responded to that, we have a new paradigm, which is the information and communications technology paradigm, ICTs. Now, as in all paradigms, there's nothing deterministic about the nature of the society will emerge. ICTs can degrade environmental sustainability. They can degrade social sustainability by more invasions of privacy, and they can enhance inequality and concentration of power in the economy. The big challenge we are now facing is to give directionality to the information and communications long wave. In my book, I'll briefly just tell you before I turn to developing countries, my prescription, the book is subtitled An Agenda for Change. The first one is that we have to reorient the finance community away from speculation, away from gambling, to supporting the economy, and particularly the green economy. Secondly, we have to, and this is a critically important and difficult one, we have to pick away and unpick the political power of the rich, the plutocracy, who define what is considered to be normality, and which tell us that tax cuts for the rich are good because it gives them incentives to work harder, but don't give social security to the poor, because if you give the poor any more money, they'll have less incentive to work. So the second agenda is to attack the political power of the plutocracy. The third one, and the critical one, and I haven't put it first because it depends on the first two of these, is a massive, massive commitment to a green economy. It's a smart green economy driven by ICTs, but it's green, green, green. This is absolutely critical. The fourth one for the rich countries is decentralization of power away from the national state to the regional, municipal, and local level, and conversely away from the nation state to global governance of the environment and of transfer pricing. And the last one in the interest of the rich countries is promoting green and development in developing countries in the interests of the rich countries. There are also moral reasons for promoting them in the interests of people in the poor countries, but it is intrinsically in the interest of the rich countries that that occurs. So briefly to end off, what about the implications for developing countries in the paradigm shift? And as Erika mentioned, we have written a paper together on this. I've learned a great deal from it, but let me just run you through the main arguments briefly. Firstly, deep globalization, export-oriented industrialization is not going to be a feasible development route. It's not going to be following the Chinese model. Anyway, in Africa, the only country which had a glimpse of that was Ethiopia. But the rich countries are pulling back now. They're reshoring to shorter supply chains. Secondly, and the point Erika made, and I've learned a great deal from us, is we have to confront this enormous issue of the so-called informal sector. The slide she showed you showed that 70 to 80% of all people outside the agricultural sector in Africa are in informalized employment. And the third one is that we have to recognize that formal manufacturing, as we've known it, the mass production economy unrolled in Africa, will lead to labor displacement because it's labor saving and capital intensive. So, and I'll finish, what are the policy implications for developing countries? Well, the 5 I mentioned for rich countries are all, of course, relevant to developing countries as well. But let me just pick out a few and emphasize it. The green issue is not a cost. Green is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to add value, it's an opportunity to make work and make production more efficient, and it's an opportunity to solve the degradation of our environment and the consequent degradation of our politics and society as well. Secondly, we have to reorient the formal sector in the way that Maureen Mackintosh has suggested, and the way that Bungie suggested. Maureen, so far as we're talking about building out capabilities in health, and Bungie with respect to linkages from the commodity sector. We have to push that formal sector away from this fixation on the biggest producing things for the highest income consumers towards these directions. Thirdly, as the previous speech suggested, there are massive opportunities in the rolling out of ICTs. And I would like to emphasize, in my experience, the most unmet of those opportunities are with respect to the agricultural sector. With a little bit of imagination and some political commitment, which we're missing, the opportunities for improving life in the rural areas and for improving agricultural productivity at the same time as giving us a regenerated environment are substantial. Finally, the informal sector, recognizing the entrepreneurial dynamism of the informal sector and the massive knowledge base of young people in Africa. There's an interesting German study on something like 12 or 15,000 Kenyans working informally over the internet, writing essays for students in rich countries. Who would have thought of this 5, 10, 15 years ago? And then finally, and I don't have time to talk about it, as globalization, deep globalization implodes, as the rich countries move inwards, so there's increasing scope for South-South trade and South-South cooperation. I don't have the time to talk about it. There are very substantial evidence that South-South trade is more inclusionary of poor people and informalized people, and is more employment intensive and more accessible to poor consumers. Unfortunately, the same evidence shows that South-South trade is not very good in its present form for the environment. So to finish off, I've given a lot of energy to ICTs. Read Bill Gates's book. It's very depressing because the Bill Gates of this world and the Melinda Gates Foundation report, which I wrote a background paper for, believe that merely by throwing ICTs at the problem, we will solve the problem. However, the whole lesson we've learned from long waves is that the social, the political, what constitutes normality, values, norms, the way we organize, where we work, where we live, how we live, is intrinsically related to the technology itself. So ICTs have this massive potential, but we have to think about the rolling out of the ICTs in a systemic way. Of course, the big problem is politics. The big problem is politics. To get the informal, in Erika's presentation, she talks about demand. To get the informal sector to really flourish, we need to get demand from low income consumers. They are the things which are going to induce the entrepreneurial capabilities in the informal sector. And that, of course, is an issue of income distribution. And as in the rich countries, this problem of income distribution, political power, control of the agenda by the plutocracy is critical. I believe there are signs of progress. Biden at least has seen the message. And I'm heartened to believe that this extraordinary dynamism of the young, educated Africans with this enormous entrepreneurial capability, writing essays for students in rich countries over the internet, has enormous possibilities for a different world. So finally, this is not argument against capitalism, although I believe I'm a democratic socialist. This is an argument for a different type of capitalism. We want a type of capitalism which is not dominated by large corporations, large technologies, large national systems of innovation, focused on the leading edge. But we want a type of capitalism which builds from the bottom, works with a small scale sector, works with the informal sector, works with clusters of small firms, and captures this amazing potential which young Africa has to offer us. It's difficult, we must never throw our hands up in the air and say we can't do it. I'm sorry, I've probably gone on a bit long.
Thank you, Prof. Excellent. There's a lot for us to discuss from your presentation. Because of time, if you don't mind, let's move to the next presentation. Then we'll have a lot of time actually to discuss. Our next speaker is Professor Rasmus Lemma. He is a professor in innovation and development at Aalborg University in Denmark. He's going to talk about greening development or green development prospects in Africa. Prof, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, sometimes I have a bit of delay when I'm working in Zoom, but let me go on. So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to speak on this occasion, this very laudable occasion. I will also be talking tomorrow. We have an extension of this seminar tomorrow, where we will be presenting a project that I've been working on in association with people from ACTS and from Moi University and from Aalborg University in Denmark. And that is on innovation and renewable electrification in Kenya, where we are focusing on solar industry and the wind industry, also working on some other technologies and some other countries, but that's the main focus of our project. So I will try to be relatively brief, not to duplicate what I'll be talking about tomorrow. What I will do is I will be talking a little bit about context, some points which will also reiterate, and in fact, some of my points have just been made in the presentation by Rafi. I will also be talking about policy implications, and we will be discussing that much more tomorrow. And I believe they also tie in very closely with the presentation that was already made by Banji in the keynote presentation. So let me start. In the context that I was just mentioning, I thought it's very useful to go back to some of Juma's publications, not least this one, which is by Juma and colleagues, Global Governance of Technology, Meeting the Needs of Developing Countries. And in that paper, they have a part of that which is about energy technology, written 20 years ago. So he says, a key question for the global governance of technology is to consider the roles that developing countries and industrialized countries can play in the process of the development and adoption of new energy systems that are necessary to meet environment, development, and security needs. And what I really like about this is that they are thinking about these issues in conjunction, that they are putting together the multiple objectives of environmental change and developmental change, not least industrialization. That's a simple but fundamental point, but in many cases in the policy arena, these things are not thought of together, which I think is a major issue in terms of creating opportunities for greening and associated industrial development gains. The big question, they go on, is that at the heart of sustainable development is that there's no simple answer to how this is done. And I think we still don't have a simple answer to this 20 years later. But what is clear is that this agenda has become much more important than it was 20 years ago, and also that there are a fundamentally changed world which creates opportunities, but also constraints. And then they go on to something important for what I'll be talking about in our project, which is that with technology available from industrialized countries, developing countries could and often do play only the role of a purchaser. So an importer of technology produced elsewhere, reflecting uneven manufacturing and innovation capabilities. However, for many developing countries, this is neither affordable, it's nor desirable. Rather, they would like to develop further technological capabilities, undertake manufacturing systems, systems integration, and energy R&D. And this is indeed the crux of the matter, and what I will be talking about. Let me start though also by stepping back a little bit and connecting to some of the points made just by Rafi. Firstly, the global green transformation is here. It's on the agenda. It's not being reversed. On the other hand, it's accelerating. It's a new world that we are operating in. The green transformation is also very costly. All aspects of the green transformation is costly. When we're talking about the greening of energy systems, what I'm talking about here, in terms of bringing down CO2 emissions, the price of energy is going to rise. So the cheapest in developing countries, the cheapest renewable sources, large hydro, for instance, they're typically exhausted. And although renewable prices are falling, getting closer to parity with fossil fuels, they are still expensive, and we still have quite a lot of technical issues with respect to storage and system integration and so on. Intermittency is a major issue. So with this in mind, should then countries in sub-Saharan Africa embrace the green transformation, the greening of energy systems, or should they adopt what colleagues have been calling industrialize first and clean up later strategy? This is something coined by Altenburg and Pegels in a recent special issue of World Development. There could be some arguments in favor of that approach. After all, sub-Saharan Africa does not have the moral obligation for cleaning up after the rich world, a point often made. And also, blocking these expensive green investments now, they can leave space for other welfare enhancing investments. So that's the opportunity cost point. Despite this, what I'll be talking about in the next slides, greening now and learning, gaining experience from that process of greening of energy systems, it's necessary. I think I missed that point in my last sentence here. It's essential, but it's very difficult to do. And this is where I will be giving some highlights and insights from the project. I just want to mention that this choice that I was mentioning, when we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, it's very difficult. In BRICS countries, this choice is a bit more straightforward. They reap significant economic gains from greening. They're achieving what is termed green growth, and they are reorienting their economies to develop competitiveness for a decarbonized world. For example, and this is building on some other work I have been doing, in China, the government has been able to create and exploit green windows of opportunity. And they're going towards leadership in many of the renewable energy technologies that are available at the moment, and some that are under development. So sub-Saharan Africa will find it very difficult to emulate what what the Chinese have done. But nevertheless, I think there are some inspiration for other countries, and that is, the degree to which the Chinese government has taken seriously and used the green transformation as an opportunity for economic development. That takes a completely different form when we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. And that is not least because of the fact that was mentioned by Ouma in the initial quote, that the vast majority of green energy technologies are still imported from China, from other parts of the world. So the windows of opportunity, they are smaller and they have many constraints. The process of greening can still provide valuable experience, industrial development gains, production and innovation capabilities, development of supply chains. The key, though, is that we need to understand much better if and where these opportunities and these experiences arise and can be gained. So a point here is that these gains, they can be reached, but they are certainly not automatic. In fact, a lot of what we'll be discussing tomorrow is the very limited degree to which these gains are gained, as it is at the moment. But there are policies that can be used and strategies to be devised. One of the key insights from our project is that it's not so useful to be thinking about complete renewable energy technologies. What we need to think about are the value chains that underpin these renewable energy technologies and the process of deploying them. So we can think about the production of these technologies and also the deployment. There are some opportunities within the manufacturing element itself. That can be some assembly task. It can be some of the peripherals, inverters, cables, rackings, and other manufacturing products that goes into the core technologies and the systems. But we've also found that most of the opportunities are really in the deployment chain, in the services elements, in the engineering, procurement, and construction element of these technologies. And this, of course, raises a lot of questions about how one can engage in some of these steps in the value chain and move those use those dynamically to move into other segments of the value chain. The key to do this is to find niches in attainable functions. That is, functions that are within reach, that can be acquired within a reasonable time frame. They should be used for leveraging and learning. And of course, in order to do this, we need to have in-depth analysis of the value chains that underpin these processes, starting with local renewable energy chains, and not least the opportunities for substituting those functions in terms of imported inputs. And as was mentioned by Raphael, one of the key drivers of the global economy at the moment with this new techno-economic paradigm is indeed the energy sector. So the energy sector is going to be much more dynamic in the future. It can have more manufacturing and service intensive activities, and there will be more openings for industrialization strategy. But it really requires that one understands how the space is moving. And gaining some foothold at an early stage is very important, because of course many of these opportunities that are there at the moment, they can close quite rapidly. So just some brief points about going forward for policy action and strategies. So new policies are needed as compared to those are in place at the moment. One key policy mission we find is that we have to change the circumstances around green infrastructure delivery. And this is really important, that we look at the process of infrastructure delivery in the green space. A lot of the policies at the moment are mainly focused on the subsequent green energy delivery part. And of course, that's very important. It helps electrify communities. It creates other elements of industrialization. We just had the intervention before. How can we electrify the process of processing fish, and so on and so forth. So there are many important industrialization advantages from greening and decentralizing energy provision. But we really have to think about the process of infrastructure delivery at the same time, because this is where most of the learning and supply chain development and job opportunities are required. So this takes a lot of innovation. It requires a lot of innovation, and not only innovation in R&D and technology. That is important, but a lot of it has to do with rethinking the deployment models of renewable energy. So that entails innovations in policy design, in innovation system creation around these technologies, the organizational models of delivery, service provision, and so on. And then also in terms of directionality, important to build on domestic niches and indigenous innovation. It was emphasized before, the importance of context specificity and building on what is appropriate in the context. So in the renewable energy space, that is not least those that are associated with distributed and small-scale deployment used for rural electrification. There's a huge market for these kinds of processes. There's still 1 billion people in the world without access to electricity. So reaching those people with renewable energy will be a key agenda also going forward. So there are market opportunities there. And of course, what will be very important is to focus on local agendas and self-reliance, as Sukona has termed it in a recent article, because it is exactly in this space, in the small scale and distributed space, that there are certain advantages and certain lower thresholds when it comes to building up capabilities and experiences that can compete with those from outside, and indeed be more appropriate for the local context than those from the outside. And then these issues that I've been raising here, we talk about green growth as mentioned, but green growth so far is mainly something which is being achieved in the rich world. But it's both a moral, it's also an instrumental imperative, and this was the point being made by Rafi, to distribute the industrial gains which are rising from the green transformation. That transformation is a global public good. It's in the interest of the world, and therefore we need also to make it in the interest of developing countries to engage in this space. So those were the words from me now. If you find this interesting and want to hear more about the findings of our project, I hope you will join us tomorrow. So for now, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Excellent, Rasmus. You've had it, colleagues, very rich, another rich presentation. And what we now do is to take questions, comments. I want to invite the panel members to come back on the stage. The 5 speakers and Banj as well. Banj, there are still questions for you to answer.
Okay, no problem. I'm here.
Let's get our speakers. So we'll have about 20 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes of questions and discussions, and then move into our closing session for today. So, questions, comments. I'm going to be assisted by the ACTS team, and Agnes and Moses. If you can assist me to identify questions.
Yes, we have put, so thank you so much, Professor Mugabe. We have put the questions together for the, I'll pick one for each of the panelists. So we can start with Maureen. Maureen, there are quite a number of questions, but I pick one for now. There's a question from Julius Mugwagwa. It is asking, in your view, has the pandemic ushered in a critical mass of new innovators to unlock some of the inertia in sustainable local production of medicines? Or are we in Africa seeing only entrepreneurship from the same established actors who may revert back to the status quo post-pandemic? Do you want me, Professor Mugabe, to pose a few of the questions?
Yes, maybe another two, then we get the panel members to respond to.
To respond to them.
Yes.
Okay, yes, then another question for Erika. It's a continuation of the question which was asked by Catherine Kireru. So the question is, do we see different innovation ecosystems in this diversity, and where is the opportunity to leapfrog these informal sectors? And another question for Erika. Maybe I just pose any lessons learned from dynamic African informal transport sector that is now the dominant player in most African transport sectors? That question is coming from Stephen. And I can jump the others. I quickly go to Raphael Kaplinsky. There's a question here, quite a number of questions for Raphael, but I think I want to ask this. There's one which has been asked by George SCB from Ghana. Is saying, green is not a cost. It is an opportunity for Africa, but there is a hidden cost, which is investment in the technologies and, more importantly, investment in capabilities. So is Africa seriously dealing with these issues about capabilities and investment? That is Kaplinsky or Lefi. There's a question for Baji, Professor Baji, and it's posed for Professor Mugabe and Professor Baji. Are we well positioned as Africa to contribute to effecting substantive agro-industrial change? That is a question for Professor Baji. A question for Shem. Should I stop there?
Please, then we get answers to these 6 or so questions. Starting with Maureen. Maureen, if you can respond to the question from Julius, I suppose.
Yeah, Julius, thanks very much for this. It's as ever from you. It's a good question. I think the jury's out on changing local entrepreneurship. I think one of the things that was probably true of a lot of the African companies working in pharmaceuticals in particular was a certain lack of ambition before COVID-19 in terms of upgrading and more complex work. There were some new actors coming in, many of them, I think, since in the last 2 or 3 years, I think particularly two striking things. One is Southern multinationals, that both Aspen, the South Africa-based multinational, and Indian and Bangladeshi multinationals in pharmaceuticals or moving back in certain cases into East Africa, and I think elsewhere. And also high-income multinationals have been displaying new interest, and of course, particularly associated with the money that's coming in for vaccines. So this is an opportunity because there's money to buy the vaccines locally, presumed in principle, once produced locally. The issue, I think, is for policymakers is really making sure that this brings true tech transfer to Africa. And I do think it involves thought about business models, about really using joint ventures effectively for tech transfer, not simply allowing them to be distribution mechanisms for external investors. I mean, the Chinese, as you know, pick up the Asian issue, just 2 more sentences. The Chinese were ruthless in making sure that joint ventures meant true build-up of new platforms. Not clear to me that African policymakers are achieving the same. And so I think there's quite a lot of thinking to be done and effective policy making to be developed to make sure that what's emerging as new investors and potentially, hopefully, new local entrepreneurship emerges. And I do think that last sentence, that in order to make that happen, one of the big players in the health field is the procurement agencies. And it does involve different and much more innovative roles for procurement if you're going to build up an effective local industry with new investors. Thanks.
Erika, 2 questions to you.
Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the questions, and thank you, Chair. I will try and answer both at the same time, if that's okay, because I think there's a connection between those 2. I hope you can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
So one of them had to do with the different innovation ecosystems and opportunities to leapfrog, and then some examples of in the African transport system and any lessons there. They are very interesting questions, and they connect in the fact that we very rarely see examples at a systemic level. So what we see is interesting initiatives that are sort of niches, operating often at a very small scale, that show us that it can be done at a small scale. What we don't know yet is how to unfold that in a way that it has systemic impact. So I can give you the example, for instance, of some very interesting initiatives related to urban development and urban regeneration in the city of Cape Town that had the attracted interest of the local government and the venture capitalists and technopreneurs, and involved the informal sector in being part and parcel of this sort of solution for an area in the district center. And it attracted a lot of interest, a lot of media attention. And for a period of time, it was very successful. Then it starts struggling with financial sustainability. Then funds and interest move elsewhere. So how to fund, how to find and ensure that these initiatives that are so successful at a small scale are able to, 1, sort of reach systemic impact, and 2, ensure financial sustainability is something that we need to look more carefully at. And I think the same happens with the transport system. We find very interesting examples of cases in which tech companies have engaged with informal the informal transport system in some municipalities have been able to sort of provide digital solutions involving informal traders and transporting goods through minibus taxis in South Africa, for instance. And again, very small scale. How do we upscale that? How do we make that change systemic? Is still a question to be answered. But thank you.
Thank you, Erika. Raphael, you have 2 questions. If you can address them, please.
John, I'm going to fuse my responses together, but I'm extremely embarrassed I have to leave after I've made my response. Is that rude?
No, it's not. I know where you are.
Okay.
Supposed to be enjoying your vacation somewhere there.
So
please, yes.
It's really around implementation, making things happen, and also making things happen perhaps with a coalition across countries between North and South. So, and with that, the nature of what constitutes the NSI and innovation. So let me first say that we have three stakeholders in change. We have governments, we've got the private sector, and we've got non-governmental organizations. If we're going to respond adequately to the systemic challenge we face, we've got to involve all of these stakeholders together in a systemic approach. And that means we have to construct alliances. Alliances which are not easy, because the alliances will require the gainers from change to compensate those who lose from change. For example, in the US, 300,000 people are going to lose their jobs in the transition to electric vehicles. Electric vehicles don't require people to make. So we have to find a way of that compensation, and there are ways of doing it. The second thing about coalitions is the coalition between these three parties have different numerators, they have different success criteria. From the private sector, the success criteria is money. From the state, the success criteria is, will I be re-elected? And from the NGO criteria, the success is one of equity. So we have three stakeholders in some way trying to work with different ways of measuring success. And of course, these coalitions will change over time. So that's my first point. My second point is, what constitutes innovation? And what is the primary task of the NSI? Bearing in mind that the agenda I've mapped out is an agenda of inclusivity, the informal sector, and people who are not normally favored by the system. In the 1970s, Toyota decided to move its car production from a single variety to a number of different types of cars. In order to do that, they had to change over the machines very rapidly to stop from one car to another car, and to take 8 hours to change over a 500-ton die is prohibitively costly. So Toyota went to the workforce and said, how can we get that down? You must halve the time you do it in. They said, halve the time? It's impossible. He said, halve it. Once they'd halved it, he said, halve it again. We can't do that. Halve it again. It now takes 2 minutes from 8 hours to change those dies. How? Because everybody is involved in designing new systems of implementation. The formal technology thrown at this problem was relatively trivial. The technology which was effective was changing the behavior and drawing on the capabilities, that's the point, drawing on the capabilities of people who often didn't have high technology and high science. So, as I said earlier on, the transition we face requires political systemic change. Away from big science, in my view, not away from, but let us also have not formal R&D, not formal innovation. In the early 1970s, I worked in Nigeria on the mechanization of Gari. The National Institute threw high tech at it. They spent in those days 50,000 pounds in a brand new aluminium machine. At the same time, I met somebody who was from Eastern Nigeria who'd been evicted because of the Civil War. He went back to Eastern Nigeria. He took a 44-gallon drum. He cut it in half. He put it on an incline. He made a fire underneath. This is the story that Calestus loved. He didn't realize that he was both frying and gelatinizing the Gari. As far as he was concerned, Gari worked. The higher science people understood the science of what they were doing, but they threw formal sector mechanisms at an approach which was inherently exclusive. Sorry, John, too long, 2 points. We have to
great.
We mean by innovation and capabilities for whom we have to build coalitions. Forgive me, everybody.
Thank you. And enjoy the rest of your holiday wherever you.
I might just do.
All the best. So let's move to the next questions. I think the next one was for Banji. Let's get Banji respond to the question on agro-processing. I think it was.
Yeah. So the question, in fact, let me take off from where Rifi ended about alliances. One of the things I found out about implementation, working with the African Development Bank, is really that you have to construct these alliances. In the agribusiness that the colleague was asking, this has been the methodology actually, because this ties to an earlier question on which value chain do we recommend. What we do, we go to all these communities, we ask them, there are 3 top commodities, because the special agro zone is built within the area of highest concentration of a particular commodity. For example, if there are top 2, 3 commodities, rice, cassava, and say cocoa, for example, those will be their top. So we bring all the stakeholders together, big private companies who will be anchor investors, small and medium enterprises. We also have a colleague from IFAD and all the other DFIs also getting involved in this. So we needed to build those coalitions to ensure that everybody in the language in my country carry along in that. So it's extremely important. So the colleague was asking me, are we sure we are going to succeed? Yeah, we are succeed. I am sure because we are already doing it. As I said, we are in about 10 countries now, and many of them are different levels of implementation. Some were already in the implementation phase. Senegal, they've started construction. In Ethiopia, they've started construction. Some are in the pipeline of projects. Some will be approved by the board this year. So we are doing well. And I end up with 2 very important examples. Part of the this whole joining of the processing hub to farming communities is that within the farming community, the biggest issues are the issues of productivity and low yield in African agriculture, and also post-harvest losses. So what we do, we bring ITA, we bring all these other groups together. In Sudan, where they used to grow cotton, extremely high temperature, 45 degrees, we developed a heat-resistant wheat because Sudan was spending so much money to import wheat. Last year, they actually cultivate 800,000 acres of wheat in that particular area. And the Sudanese government, in the next 2-3 years, they're fully sufficient in wheat. Same in Ethiopia. Ethiopia has 1.7 million tons deficit of wheat. Last year, they harvested 1 million tons. Again, through this particular technology we call Technology for African Agricultural Transformation. The African Development Bank is working very closely with ITA and these other colleagues in different areas. So it's working. I think it's about bringing different stakeholders together. It's about vision, it's about leadership, both at the country level and within the DFIs and the other international community. So we're going to make it work. Africa needs to make it work because we really don't have a choice. We can't continue this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Banji. And do we have any more questions?
Yes, we do. Yeah, we do. We can take another round of questions. Yes, one going to Shem. In 2020, amidst COVID-19, Kenyans in diaspora remitted more money compared to 2 sectors, tourism and industry. What does that tell us in terms of innovation and industrialization? That's a question for Shem. We have a question for Rasmus. In addition to electrification, which has received significant attention in Africa, are there important opportunities in the heating market for technological development and enterprise development in Africa, particularly in the agro-industrial sector? For instance, in the bio-based cogeneration. And then a final question, Erika has several. I can pick this one, which was posted by Maureen, Mackintosh. Have you looked in details, Erika, at the mix of formal and informal relationships, that is employment, finance, access to technology, that characterize the important middle-sized family farms? Maybe I stop there and then we can come back if you have time. Back to you, Professor Mugabe.
Yes, Shem, there's a question for you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John and Anne. Yes, indeed, remittances did not only exceed actually 2 times what Kenya has been earning annually from tourism. Normally it's about $1.2 billion. Remittances was about 3 times that. And also even from agricultural exports, the major foreign exchange earner for Kenya has been agricultural products. Tea, $1.2 billion. Horticulture, $1 billion. And coffee, about $400 million. Together, we are talking about 2.6 billion. So yes, diaspora remittances was more. But having said that, it doesn't stop there. There are activities diaspora already implementing, including diaspora returnees, establishing cottage industries. One good example in one of the rural Kenyan, Kisii County, where a team of Kenya Diaspora Alliance have set up a factory relying mainly on banana, but producing 10 different products from banana, including banana jam, sanitizer, soap, wine, ladies' wigs, about 10 different products just from banana, employing 100 people. What we are trying to do at the moment is to build a network. There are silos of such cottage industries and micro industries. We're working with about 10 different county governments, with governors. How do we, instead of operating as silos, how do we build them into a network of cottage industries for better effect? Maybe that's the way to industrialize. And I should say Kenya's administration has prioritized industrialization. The current administration for Big Four agenda, food security, universal health coverage, affordable housing, and industrialization. So there's a major focus on industrialization as a means to employ, and particularly if we can bring in diaspora capital. Related to that, I should also mention we're working on what we call the Mama Mboga Fund with micro finances, with women in business, Kenya Chamber of Commerce, looking at how do we empower what we call Mama Mboga. Mama Mboga is Swahili word for the hawkers, if I may, micro to small enterprises. So again, that's another we working on with the accelerators. I may not have to mention names, but including a couple of tier 1 commercial banks that are interested in leveraging diaspora resources. The attraction here is that even for financial institutions, banks and insurances, their major clientele now is diaspora. So it's become like a gold mine, which we need to tap much more into. Finally, John, if I may, diaspora resources go beyond just financial. In terms of intellectual capital, the World Academy of Sciences, Trieste, Italy, did launch 2 years ago the report on scholarly global publications. It turned out that Africa's share was only 2%. It was launched in Kigali, Rwanda. The question that was being raised was, where are Rwandese professors? Because of that 2%, 67% came only from 2 countries, South Africa and Egypt, okay? So where are the Nigerian doctors, the Kenyan engineers, and other countries? Why are they not publishing? The question then turned around, why are we just focusing on the 2%? Why don't we look at the 98%, change the narrative? Of the 98%, whether it's German or Chinese or Japanese, how much of it is African? Because it's reported that there are more Nigerian doctors in Texas state in the US than the whole of Nigeria, more Ghanaian doctors in Manhattan City than the whole of Ghana. The average Kenyan born in the US, this is official US Statistics Bureau data, is more educated than the average American. The average Kenyan born in the US has got a 2nd degree. So this African capital in the diaspora, how can we tap into it? So I just wanted to mention there's a financial resource, but let's also look at the intellectual capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Shem. Yes, Rasmus, there was a question for you. Please,
yes, thank you very much. I noted 2 questions in the chat. The first one was the question by Stephen. And that was about the linkages, as I understand the question, between agro industry and the biomass sector. And I think this is a really good question, because when we think about industrialization strategy, it's very much about thinking about such interlinkages. Where are there some activities that are generating forward, backward, and horizontal linkages? And this is exactly one of the very productive linkages that can sort of tailor in and create synergy with an expansion of the agro-industrial sector. Because all of the waste products that are produced out of the agro sector can be used in the biomass technology to create electricity. So that's an obvious low-hanging fruit, which is a great opportunity. And when it comes to the biomass, I encourage you to also attend our seminar tomorrow. We have two experts who will be talking not about biomass actually, but who are experts in biomass. One is Charles Nsila, and another one is Ulrik Hansen. And what I understand from them about how the biomass sector works is that in fact the technology is quite simple. Right now, most of the technology is sourced from India, also from China. But in principle, that technology is potentially worthy of acquiring. And then the main activity is really not about that core technology of the biomass kettle and so on. It's about the entire construction of the plant. So this ties in with the discussion about opportunities in engineering, procurement, and construction I was mentioning earlier, because this is an area where capabilities can be gained, and I think local competitiveness can be achieved. So I really like that question. Then I also just want to give a brief answer to the question by Alphonse, and he's asking how to counter the delocalization trends in the technology space I was talking about. And I mean, in addition to the points I've already been talking about, the countering of those trends is by being quite aggressive and quite strategic about localization policy. Localization policy is absolutely essential to make sure that it ties in, of course, with local needs, but also in terms of making sure that all the elements that can be procured locally should be procured locally. So how to be strategic about localization policy? One very important element is about changing the bargaining power relationship between local users, typically the local governments, and foreign producers. And I think some of the cases that we have been studying, some of the projects, have been really negotiated on an ad hoc basis, not least by the Chinese. So there's no systematic framework for evaluating different projects. And that really changes the bargaining power in favor of the producers. So we need more systematic processes for project evaluation. That's one element. Another element is local content requirements. And in fact, Anne Kingiri will be talking more about LCR policies tomorrow. The question is really, well, one issue is about how much can we get away with in terms of local content issues. It's controversial, but nevertheless, as I mentioned, it's a part of the grander big of the scheme of things in terms of distributing the gains. So it should be in the interest of the international community. But the question is really about how to design these local content policies. For how long time should they be in place? For which elements of the manufacturing and service process should we have them in place? And so on and so forth. So that's my answer. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We ran out of time, and we have some more other activity. And the activity is that we are being requested by the organizers to spend just a few minutes to do an evaluation. I think we've received, all of us have received on the chart, the Mentimeter the link. If we can go to that link, and Agnes, if you can guide us.
Yes, hi, Prof. Moses has shared the link with everyone on call. Kindly, if you can click the link, and he's also shared the code, and the code is also being on your screen. Kindly click the link, and what's very important, everyone on call, if you can share some of the ideas on the topics that you would like to see, especially regarding CJ's work that you would like to see discussed in the future seminars. We would really appreciate your feedback on that. The link is shared already in the chat. So just and the question is already also on your screen. So kindly just click that link and share your ideas on that.
Thank you, Agnes. We had questions for Erika, and I don't know whether we allow Erika to respond to them today or we take them tomorrow.
So maybe as people address the questions on the Mentimeter, maybe we could just hear briefly what Erika has to say. There are quite a number of questions to Erika, but we are going to direct them to her and see whether they can be responded to, and then we share that together with the proceedings to the participants. Back to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you. I think we take it that way, that Erika is going to respond to the questions, I think, writing back to those who asked them. We'll also have an opportunity tomorrow to discuss some of these issues. Erika, if that's okay with you, because we want to.
Yes. That is absolutely fine. Yes. I think for the benefit of time, let's proceed that way.
Yes, because
we want. Thank you for all that posed the questions.
Yes, we want to ask Professor Gada and Angela to make closing statements, very short, because we've run out of time. I know we have many questions still to address. So Angela and Tom.
Okay, Angela, do you want to go first?
Hold on one second, just getting my windows arranged, but sure, I'm happy to. I just want to say again, thank you so much to all of the panelists, the participants, and especially the team at ACTS, Professor Ogada, and your entire board. We're very, very grateful for this opportunity to continue the legacy of Calestis Juma. And to collaborate on future ongoing efforts to benefit the African continent. So thank you very much, and we hope we'll be seeing you all tomorrow. And over to you.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Again, thanks very much, John, on behalf of the Governing Council and the staff of the African Center for Technology Studies. I also take this opportunity to really thank all the participants that joined us today in this launch, and really to appreciate all the speakers that have provided very, very useful information to the theme of the seminar. And I'm delighted that we have spent about 5 hours just talking about industrialization of Africa through innovation. And I think perhaps going forward, this is the way to go, so that in each of the seminars that we'll be having, we'll be focusing on one theme, and we'll want to ensure that we do good justice to the theme, But more importantly, and this one we promise and we need to repeat, that we want to ensure that from each of these seminars, there are specific outputs, which will include proceedings. So we are going to prepare a proceeding that we'll be able to share with all the participants, but we'll also explore possibility of coming up with policy briefs that we can use to help influence policy making in Africa, starting with the issue of industrialization of Africa. Otherwise, I also then want to say a big thank you to the CJ Legacy Foundation for collaborating with us in organizing this launch seminar, and we look forward to working very closely with the organization in organizing the follow-up seminars and exploring any other opportunities that might be there to help us implement activities in honor of the great Professor Callistus Juma. So thank you very much, John. And of course, I should not forget to also thank you for moderating the second phase of the seminars today, which you have done very, very ably. Asante sana, and be blessed. Back to you, John.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our first day. Tomorrow we have another day. So thank you to the speakers, excellent presentations, rich discussions, and I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, your evening. Great.